The war was supposed to weaken the IRGC. It has actually strengthened it. IRGC was much better able to sell Iran's oil. And I suspect that that is continuing with the recent decision by the United States to allow Iran export oil. They used sanctions on oil to prepare the conditions to attack Iran. Now that they've attacked, they rather remove the sanctions.
Trump says that the U.S. is in negotiations with Iran, but Tehran says that Washington is negotiating with itself. Meanwhile, the bombs are still falling. Oil is trading above $100 a barrel, and a fifth of the world's oil supplies flow through a strait that Iran is now demanding sovereignty over. The war that began on February 28th has thrown the global economy into turmoil, but what has it done to Iran's economy?
Well, I spoke to Djavad Salehi-Isfahani, who is professor of economics at Virginia Tech, and he spoke of an economy that was already on its knees, its currency in free fall, food inflation at 70%, and why the sanctions that were supposed to bring the regime to its knees is doing the opposite. The problem is an internet blackout is making it hard to measure just how difficult the economic pressure is becoming for ordinary Iranians.
Most of the times during wars, the distribution becomes a bigger issue than the total supply, because the poor may lose their jobs, they don't have access to income, and prices are rising because of the war conditions, so they can't buy things and they may be suffering with hunger and so on. But that doesn't happen in the modern world, where the government can deposit currency in people's ATM accounts instantaneously. The one thing about Iran that's important, of course, everybody knows, is that Iran is energy rich. A lot of times in countries that go into war, access to energy like gasoline, heating, and so on disappears, and people are suffering. I bet if you are in Tehran right now, you have easier access to gasoline than people in the Philippines, for example, or a lot of other countries where there are big lines because prices have risen. Energy prices are very low in Iran, and so far there seems to be reasonable supplies. And
Okay.
as long as they don't hit the infrastructure dealing with energy supplies, I think that part of life, which is to be able to drive around and also heat your home and so on, will continue.
Now, we know, of course, that the Iranian economy particularly depends on oil revenue. Certainly the budget of the government does. So how does this leap in the oil prices affect that?
Well, ironically, a leap in oil prices has helped Iran in a war that it itself has caused the price increases. So it's a bit self-serving. Because Iran has control of the Strait of Hormuz, which is its major asset in this war, perhaps next to having missiles. It is able to allow its own ships or ships with oil that is going to benefit it, meaning it's reaching a destination where it can actually use the money. Uh, that has enabled Iran to maybe get a lot more for its oil, maybe also export more oil. Iran was exporting a little over 1 million barrels per day before this, and I suspect that that is continuing with the recent decision by the United States, which is the height of irony, to allow Iran export oil. They use sanctions on oil to prepare the conditions to attack Iran. Now that they've attacked, they rather remove the sanctions. And so I think that's kind of has created a bit of a strange situation. Iran is probably exporting, again, more than a million barrels per day. The sanctions, just to hasten to add, the removal of sanctions is about the oil that's already afloat on ships, I think 140 million barrels, which is worth about $14-15 billion on the market. So Iran's access to foreign currency, as low as it was, it hasn't deteriorated very much under the war conditions.
What impact have sanctions actually had on the Iranian government until the war? Have they been an effective tool at all from the US policy side of things?
Well, there are two kinds of effects that people talk about. One is the effect on incomes of the people or access to resources by the authorities. The other is the impact on their decision making. I mean, the purpose was not just to make people feel miserable. The purpose was to get them to, if there were civilians, to topple the government, for the government to feel the pressure and change its policies. Those did not happen. In fact, the opposite happened. People didn't become more prone to protest. There were more protests, some very successful protests, like the life freedom, women life freedom movement of 3 years ago that led to the removal of forced hijab. So that turned into unsuccessful protests that were harshly clamped down, like the protests a month ago, which had more of an economic character. Uh, so I don't see how one could ultimately assess the sanctions regime as having been successful. It didn't create the success uh, to get the population to put more pressure on the government because the government had the guns and could clamp down. And it didn't cause the government to become more likely to accept US terms. In fact, in my view and view of many, the government has become less likely to accept US terms. And it is waging a very destructive war against its neighbors as a way of compelling the United States to uh, to take fewer concessions than it might have. And we don't know how things are going to proceed.
Yes, so putting aside from the fact that the US has found it difficult to sanction Iran and get its goals completed anyway, has Eastern partners been particularly instrumental to Iran for having a kind of pressure release valve, having alternatives in order to avoid the impacts of US sanctions?
Yes, very much so, especially after the war started. Uh, U.S. sanctions didn't. U.S. sanctions against Iran did not impact China's fortunes that much because oil is fungible. Chinese could import from Saudi Arabia or other places. But once the war started, another element was created, which is, can the U.S. control oil supplies from the Persian Gulf area? In which case, it might not be willing to sell to Chinese or sell it if the Chinese make concessions on other issues like Taiwan and so on. And I don't know exactly how China is helping. It's probably a military secret as well. There are rumors that they supply Iran with information from satellites and so on. But the fact that the Chinese are trying to prevent U.S. from controlling sources of oil for China from Venezuela and from Persian Gulf is a very important incentive for the Chinese to remain involved. One way they will continue to remain involved is to accept Iranian oil in return for yuan payments in Chinese currency or in kind. So if China weren't there, the US sanctions would be much more biting in the sense that Iran would sell the oil. If the money goes to any bank account, as US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has correctly, I think, threatened, US can block those accounts, meaning it prevent the transformation of the currencies from dollar to currencies that Iran needs to buy stuff, say from Malaysia and so on. But right now, that is not a constraint. So my feeling is that China is very much interested in a kind of a equilibrium, not for the war to cease very quickly and Iran be defeated, because then the U.S. Monopoly over Persian Gulf energy becomes becomes a fact, but also for Iran to be able to remain in the Chinese orbit, still needing China either for supply of military hardware or for goods in exchange for oil. It's a kind of a barter that Chinese are able to make because they have such variety of commodities that people want.
Now, just a bit more on the oil aspect. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, is reported to control about half of Iran's oil export revenues. So when we talk about the Iranian economy, are we actually talking about two parallel economies, one for ordinary Iranians and one that funds the military machine?
Yes. Well, again, another irony. The war was supposed to weaken the IRGC. It has actually strengthened it. Not just the war, but the sanctions did that too. IRGC was much better able to sell Iran's oil, chaperone it through the global waters, international waters, find the destination, keep the money, bring the money back, and so on. So that's how they gained so much control of the oil supplies. A time came that the IRGC would accept shiploads of crude as part of its budgetary allocation, because they were in a position to sell it. Iran had the experience of having private sector sell it. There's a famous case where one of these guys who's still around, who sold this oil, did not bring $3 billion worth of it back. So Iran turned to IRGC even more for handling the export of oil. IRGC's importance does not come from control of oil supplies, really, because once you are the only military authority in any place, you have power. It could be Pakistan or Egypt. They have very strong militaries and with a lot of economic interests. In Iran, IRGC became important as a result of sanctions because it directly was handling exports, as opposed to waiting for private sector to make the exports and then lay its claim powerfully through the budget process.
You have friends and family in Iran. What are they telling you about the situation at the moment? And what are you listening out for from them to understand the situation as it's going forward and what happens next?
I'm sure you know that internet is down. Communications is one way. They can call us, we can't call them. So, but I'm very curious. So I do ask who's alive, who's dead, and I try to keep track of even the moods of the population from distance. One of the most interesting things is that a lot of Iranians, even when I was there less than a year ago and talked to people, they were hopeful that military intervention could quickly topple the regime. Why? Because they watch the same propaganda that everybody watches abroad. They don't have their own way of knowing how secure the Iranian government is. So TV station Iran International gave them the feeling that an attack by the US could quickly liberate them. So they were very hopeful. But once they saw the actual face of war, which most Iranians have never seen, there was a brief period when Iraqis were bombing some cities in Iran, but not all. They became more aware of how wrong that Western prediction was, that military could quickly settle everything and Iranians would be liberated. They are becoming at least ambivalent about the continuation of the war. But nobody's hiding how bad the conditions are. When the sound of bombs, the sound of airplanes at night come, I don't think many Iranians are able to sleep unless they take medication for a sleep. It is so forceful.
You've been watching a sneak preview of our podcast, The Dip, where we cover money stories that cross borders.
That's right. And if you want to check out the full episode, then all you need to do is to scan that QR code that's on the bottom of your screen right now. And you can also subscribe to the podcast.
And we'll be back with more, same time, same place. But thanks for watching The Dip.
The Dip. See ya. Bye.